Before Thanksgiving dinner, I sat in my car and pressed record. Coach Dennis had just told me, in writing, that my 14-year-old daughter would ride the bench all season unless I paid him $300 a month in cash for private consulting. What he didn't know was that we live in a one-party consent state. Every word he said was being captured, and that recording was about to become the single most expensive mistake of his career. This is Patricia, a 38-year-old mother who just wanted her daughter to play the sport she loved. But when Coach Dennis drew a line between her kid and the court unless she paid up, Patricia didn't just get angry. She got evidence. What followed would expose a scheme targeting 8 families, end a career, and prove that one mother with a recording is more powerful than any coach with a clipboard. Patricia didn't set out to become a whistleblower. She was just a mom who showed up to every game, cheered from the bleachers, and believed that the court was the one place where talent and hard work actually mattered. Her daughter, Maya, had been playing since she was 6 years old. By 14, she was the starting point guard, a natural leader who could read the floor before the defense even moved. Other parents called her the engine of the team, and Patricia couldn't have been prouder. That small community league team was the center of their world. The coach, Dennis Rourke, had been there for 3 seasons. He was charismatic, known for his tough love approach, and he talked a lot about building character. Parents trusted him. The league board praised his dedication. He had the kind of reputation that silenced doubt, because if you questioned the coach, you weren't just questioning his methods, you were questioning your own commitment as a parent. That reputation was exactly what he was counting on. Then, halfway through the fall season, Maya's minutes started to disappear without explanation. She went from starting every quarter to sitting out entire halves. Patricia assumed it was a tactical decision, maybe a minor injury she didn't know about. So she sent a polite email asking if there was anything Maya needed to work on. The response came not in an email, but as a phone call late on a Thursday night. Coach Dennis said they needed to have an important conversation about Maya's development, and he preferred to discuss it in person. He suggested they meet privately after the next practice. Patricia felt a knot forming in her stomach, but she told herself it was just a coach being thorough. She couldn't have been more wrong. When they met, he didn't talk about drills or shooting form. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said that Maya had incredible potential, but potential doesn't guarantee playing time. He explained that he offered a private consultant program, $300 a month, paid in cash, no receipts. He didn't call it a bribe, he called it an investment. Then he made the threat crystal clear. Without that investment, he couldn't guarantee Maya would see the floor again this season. Patricia felt the room tilt. Her first instinct was to negotiate, to find some middle ground. But the look on his face told her that this wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. She drove home in silence, replaying the conversation over and over. That night, she started making calls. Quiet, careful calls to other parents she trusted. At first, no one wanted to talk, but slowly the truth started to surface. One parent broke down and admitted she'd been paying him for over a year, and suddenly her son had become a starter overnight. Another family had just started making payments after their daughter was benched for missing practice, a practice she missed because of a doctor's appointment the coach knew about. Patricia realized this wasn't a one-time demand. It was a system. By the end of the week, she had identified 8 families who were being squeezed for cash, all terrified to speak up because no one wanted to be the parent who got their kid blacklisted. That's when Patricia remembered something she'd heard years ago from a friend who worked in law enforcement. Her state allows one-party consent for recording phone calls. That meant if she was part of the conversation, she could record it without telling the other person. She spent an entire Saturday doing her research, reading state statutes, making absolutely sure she was on solid legal ground. Then she called Coach Dennis back. She told him she'd thought about his offer and wanted to discuss the details. He was happy to take the call. Patricia set her phone on the table, pressed record, and took a deep breath. The line connected, and she heard his voice. He had no idea that the next words out of his mouth would soon be heard by the entire league board. The call lasted 17 minutes. Patricia barely spoke. She just asked open-ended questions and let Coach Dennis fill the silence, and fill it he did. He laid out the terms like he was presenting a business proposal. $300 per month, cash only, delivered in an envelope after practice. He explained that this was how he'd always operated, that the parents who were in the program saw results, and that the ones who weren't understood the consequences. He said those exact words, understood the consequences. He even named one of the other paying families by mistake, then caught himself and said she didn't hear that. Patricia just kept nodding along on her end of the line, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid he'd hear it through the phone. When the call ended, she sat in her living room for a full 10 minutes just staring at the recording app on her phone. The file was there. 17 minutes and 23 seconds of crystal clear audio. She pressed play and listened again, and the second time through, she heard details she'd missed on the live call. The way he used specific playing time minutes as bargaining chips. The casual admission that he'd been running the program for multiple seasons. The matter-of-fact tone like this was just how youth sports worked. No hesitation, no shame, no awareness that what he was describing was textbook extortion. But here's the thing about recording a predator. Having the evidence is only half the battle. The harder question is what you do with it. Patricia spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled panic. She barely slept. She couldn't tell Maya what was happening, couldn't explain why she was so distracted. She just kept replaying the recording, memorizing every phrase, every admission, every piece of leverage she now held in her hands. And she kept thinking about the other families, the ones who'd been paying for months, some for years, too scared and embarrassed to come forward. She couldn't let them stay invisible. Her first call was to a lawyer, a family friend who'd handled a custody case for her cousin years ago. She played him the recording without saying a word first. When it finished, there was a long pause on his end. Then he asked one question. "Did you tell him you were recording?" She said no. He asked where she was located during the call. She told him. Another pause. Then he said 4 words that changed everything. "You're in the clear." He explained that the state's one-party consent law meant the recording was fully admissible, not just in civil complaints but in criminal proceedings. What Coach Dennis had done wasn't just unethical, it was prosecutable. Extortion. The word hung in the air like a verdict. That night, Patricia made a list. 8 families. She'd been given names and fragments of stories during her initial calls, but now she needed documentation. She contacted each one individually, meeting them at coffee shops and parking lots, anywhere Dennis wouldn't think to look. She played them the recording. Every single parent had the same reaction. First shock, then a kind of sick relief that someone had finally caught him, then anger. Deep, volcanic anger. One father, a man whose son had been benched for an entire season after he refused to pay, had to step outside and compose himself before he could continue the conversation. A mother of twins broke down crying and admitted she'd been paying for 2 slots for 18 months, draining savings she didn't have, because she was convinced her daughters would lose their only chance at college recruitment. Patricia gathered their stories like evidence. Dates, amounts, the specific threats Dennis had made to each family. The pattern was undeniable. He targeted families who couldn't afford private clubs, kids whose only access to competitive play was through this community league. He preyed on hope and fear in equal measure, and he'd refined his pitch over multiple seasons until it was smooth enough to sound almost reasonable. Almost. There were families who'd left the league entirely, pulling their kids out of the sport they loved because they couldn't stomach the corruption. Some of them had been gone for 2 years, and they'd never told anyone why until Patricia called. Now Patricia had a choice, and it was a big one. She could go to the league board quietly, present the evidence, and hope they handled it internally. That was the path of least resistance, but she'd seen how institutions protect their own. She'd read the stories about coaches who got quiet suspensions and transferred to different leagues, leaving the same pattern of abuse intact. She wasn't going to let that happen. So she made a second call, this time to the district office, the governing body that oversaw all community athletics in the county. She identified herself, said she had evidence of a felony being committed against multiple families, and asked to speak with someone in their legal department. The receptionist's tone shifted immediately from polite to serious. She was patched through to an investigator within the hour. That conversation changed the trajectory of everything. The investigator asked if Patricia was willing to provide the recording and the names of the other families. She said yes. He asked if she understood that this could lead to criminal charges and that she might be called to testify. She said yes. Then he told her something she hadn't expected. Her complaint wasn't the first. There had been murmurs about Coach Dennis before, anonymous tips that never went anywhere because no one was willing to go on the record. Patricia was the first person to bring hard evidence, and the district had been waiting for exactly this moment. But they needed Patricia to do one more thing before they could move. They needed her to keep up appearances. Don't pay him, they said, but don't confront him either. Let him think the deal was still in play. They needed time to build the case, to interview the other families, to verify the financial records. If Dennis got spooked and destroyed evidence, the whole thing could collapse. So Patricia had to walk into the next practice, look Coach Dennis in the eye, and pretend everything was normal. She had to watch him run drills and give pep talks, knowing she held a recording that could end his career, and she couldn't say a word. The hardest part was watching Maya, because Maya still didn't know anything was wrong. All she knew was that she was still on the bench and her mom hadn't fixed it yet. Patricia couldn't tell her that the fix was coming, just not in the way either of them expected. The waiting period was the hardest part, those 2 weeks of smiling at practices while the investigation quietly assembled behind the scenes. Patricia watched Coach Dennis like a hawk, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before. He was comfortable, too comfortable. The way he chatted with the league board members who stopped by, the easy familiarity of inside jokes, the pats on the back after games. He wasn't just a coach. He was embedded. And that meant Patricia couldn't trust anyone inside the league until she knew exactly who knew what. The district investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Sharon Webb, and she moved with the kind of quiet precision that told Patricia she'd done this many times before. She interviewed each of the 8 families separately, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a timeline that stretched back almost 4 years. What she uncovered went far beyond anything Patricia had imagined. Dennis hadn't just been shaking down the families on Maya's team. He'd been running the same scheme across 3 different age groups, cycling through teams as kids aged up, always finding new parents who were too afraid to say no. The total amount Webb estimated from the records was staggering, over $100,000 in unreported cash payments, all of it tax-free, all of it extracted under threat. But then came the twist that changed the entire case from an extortion investigation into something much bigger. While tracing Dennis's background, Detective Webb discovered that he had been quietly removed from a coaching position in a neighboring county 5 years ago. The official reason given was a resignation due to personal reasons, but Webb's contacts revealed the truth. He'd been accused of nearly identical conduct there, demanding payments from parents, and the league had let him walk away quietly to avoid a scandal. They gave him a neutral reference. They didn't warn anyone. And now he was here, doing it all over again, because the system had protected him instead of the kids. Patricia nearly lost her composure when she heard that. All of this could have been prevented. Every family he'd hurt in her league, every dollar he'd extorted, every kid who quit the sport or lost their confidence, all of it was preventable if one institution had done the right thing 5 years earlier. That knowledge burned in her chest like a fire, and it transformed her mission from protecting her daughter into something much larger. She wasn't just going to get Dennis removed. She was going to make sure no league could ever quietly shuffle him away again. But Dennis still didn't know who was behind the investigation, and as the second week passed, his patience ran out. He'd been expecting Patricia's first payment, and when the envelope didn't appear, he started pressing. First came the text messages, carefully worded but unmistakably pointed. Just checking in on our arrangement. Maya's development window is closing. We wouldn't want her to fall behind. Patricia forwarded every one of them to Detective Webb without responding. Then Dennis escalated to phone calls, and this time Patricia was ready. She hit record again and she answered. The second recorded call was even more revealing than the first. Dennis dropped the consultant pretense entirely. He was angry now, his voice tight with controlled fury. He said that if Patricia thought she could ignore their agreement, she was making a huge mistake. He said he had influence with every coach in the county, that he could make sure Maya never played competitive ball again anywhere. He said that all it would take was a few strategic conversations about her attitude, her coachability, and her family's lack of commitment, and no program would touch her. He was threatening to blacklist a 14-year-old girl across an entire region, to destroy her reputation and her future in the sport she loved, all because her mother refused to pay a bribe. Patricia listened to the whole thing, gave him nothing but calm one-word answers, and when she hung up, her hands were shaking so hard she could barely text Detective Webb. That call changed the legal calculus. What had been extortion now included elements of criminal coercion and witness intimidation, because by that point, Dennis had been informed that an investigation was underway. He didn't know Patricia was the source, but he knew something was closing in, and instead of backing off, he doubled down. The district legal team upgraded the case status and began coordinating with the county prosecutor's office. This was no longer a personnel matter. It was a criminal case with multiple felony charges on the table. Then, with 48 hours remaining before the scheduled league board meeting where everything would be revealed, the containment broke. One of the 8 parents, a father who had been paying Dennis for 2 years and had recently been pressured to increase his payments, couldn't hold it together anymore. He confronted Dennis directly in the parking lot after a late practice. The argument was loud, it was public, and by the time it was over, Dennis knew exactly who had been talking to the district and what kind of evidence they had. He drove home that night knowing his entire house of cards was about to collapse, and a desperate man is a dangerous man. Patricia's phone rang at 11:30 that night. It was Detective Webb with an urgent warning. Dennis had been seen removing boxes from the league office, and he'd told one of the assistant coaches that he wasn't going down without making sure everyone who betrayed him paid the price. The board meeting was in 2 days. Patricia locked her doors, checked on Maya sleeping in her room, and waited for the sun to rise on the day everything would come crashing down. The league board meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the community center conference room, the same room where parents usually gathered for end-of-season pizza parties. But there was no pizza that night. Patricia arrived early with Detective Webb and a representative from the district attorney's office. She carried a folder containing both recordings, the full transcripts, and signed statements from all 8 families. The board members filed in one by one, and Patricia could see the confusion on their faces shift into something heavier as they registered the presence of law enforcement. Coach Dennis walked in last, and for the first time, he didn't look like the man who'd controlled a room for 4 years. His eyes swept across the table, found Patricia, and narrowed. He knew. The board president called the meeting to order and Detective Webb took the floor. She didn't start with accusations. She started with the recording. The audio filled the room. Dennis's voice, clear and unmistakable, explaining his consultant program, nomming his price, threatening playing time, casually referencing other families who'd paid up. Patricia watched the board members' faces as they listened. First disbelief, then disgust, then a kind of horrified recognition as they realized how thoroughly they'd been deceived. One board member, a retired teacher who championed Dennis's hearing, put her head in her hands. Another pushed his chair back from the table like he needed physical distance from what he was hearing. When the recording ended, the room was silent for a full 30 seconds. Then Dennis tried to speak. He called it a misunderstanding. He said the payments were voluntary donations for equipment. He said Patricia was a disgruntled parent whose daughter simply wasn't good enough to start. That was when the second recording played, the one where he'd threatened to blacklist a 14-year-old across every program in the county. There was no spinning that. The board voted unanimously to terminate Dennis's contract effective immediately, but that was just the beginning. The district representative announced that the case had been referred to the county prosecutor for criminal charges, including extortion, coercion, and fraud. The detective explained that because Patricia's recordings were legally obtained under one-party consent laws, they were fully admissible and they represented an airtight case. Dennis didn't say another word. He stood up, walked out of the room, and never coached another game anywhere in the state. But here's where the story gets even bigger. Once the news broke, the 8 families weren't the only ones who came forward. Within a week, the district had received calls from 17 more parents spanning multiple teams and multiple seasons. Some had paid Dennis for years and never told anyone because they were ashamed. Others had quit the league entirely and were only now learning that they hadn't been alone. The total amount of documented payments surpassed $200,000. The investigation expanded into a full audit of the league's finances, and what they found was a nearly complete absence of oversight. No one had ever checked. No one had ever asked. Detective Webb's team also opened a formal inquiry into the neighboring county that had allowed Dennis to resign quietly 5 years earlier. The league director there was placed on administrative leave, and the investigation uncovered a systemic pattern of covering up coach misconduct to protect the reputation of the organization. Multiple families from that county are now pursuing civil action. The wall of silence that had protected Dennis for years had crumbled, and the people who'd built it were now under the same spotlight. For Patricia, the biggest moment wasn't any of that. It came the following Saturday at Maya's first game under the new coach. The team ran out onto the court, and Maya ran with them, not from the bench but from the starting lineup. She'd earned her spot back the moment the extortionist was removed, because the new coach evaluated her based on exactly one thing: her ability to play the game. Patricia watched from the stands, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the knot in her stomach. She just felt proud. Maya scored 18 points that game, and when the final buzzer sounded, she looked up at her mom in the bleachers and smiled. That smile was worth more than every dollar Dennis ever tried to steal. The final piece of the story came 6 weeks later, when the prosecutor's office announced that Dennis Rourke had accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of extortion and was sentenced to probation, community service, and a permanent ban from coaching youth sports anywhere in the state. His name was added to a statewide registry of coaches who'd been removed for misconduct. He can't quietly move to another county and start over. That door is closed forever. Patricia's 17-minute recording didn't just get one bad coach fired. It created a permanent record that will follow him for the rest of his life, and it prompted the district to implement mandatory financial transparency rules for every coach in every sport. No more cash payments. No more private arrangements. No more shadows for the next Dennis to hide in. The story of Patricia and Maya is about one mother's refusal to let a predator steal her daughter's joy, but zoom out and it's about something much bigger. It's about the quiet vulnerability of every youth sports system in America, where trust is placed in coaches, oversight is often non-existent, and the people who speak up are frequently the ones who suffer consequences. The only reason Dennis Rourke was able to operate for years is that silence was easier than confrontation, and institutions preferred to protect their reputations rather than the children they were supposed to serve. What Patricia did required more than courage. It required knowledge. She knew her state's recording laws. She documented everything. She didn't just get mad, she got smart. That one-party consent statute wasn't some abstract legal technicality. It was a weapon she used to level a playing field that had been tilted against families for years. Without that recording, no one would have believed her. With it, she didn't just win, she made sure no one else had to lose the same way. So the question worth asking is this: how many other coaches like Dennis are still out there, operating in the shadows of leagues that don't ask questions? How many parents are paying right now, not because they want to, but because they're terrified of what happens if they don't? The answer is unknown, but one thing is certain. The next Patricia who finds herself in that situation now has a blueprint. Record the call, document the threats, find the other families, and never, ever assume the system will protect you unless you force it to. If this story resonated with you, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another. The truth doesn't always win on its own, but with the right evidence and the right people willing to step forward, it has a fighting chance. Patricia proved that. Now you know it too.